So we'll go ahead and get started. Um, Folks, I want to welcome you tonight to our Mountain Zoom series. We have with us tonight Dr. Chad Lee from the University of Kentucky, and he is going to be speaking on sweet sorghum production. And I'm going to let him share any other details that he wants to fill in. But Dr. Lee, it's all yours.
Well, I appreciate the invitation to come talk to you all tonight. We're going to go through a series of slides on sweet sorghum. And as I walk through this, if you want to put a question in the chat or something and then have Shad jump back in at any point, feel free to do that as well. If you have some questions afterwards, feel free to reach out that way also. But we'll walk through this together and we'll go from there on it. And so we were just talking before the formal presentation about Dr. Morris Bitzer and his impact on sweet sorghum, and really all of the pioneering research at the university was done by Dr. Bitzer. Dr. Todd Pfeiffer came in and did a lot of work on plant genetics as well. Morris had started a plant breeding program with sweet sorghum, and Todd carried that on until he retired about a year ago at this point. And then I've got some pictures in here from James Dollarhide. James is from the mountains in Kentucky, and his family still does some sorghum. And so when I was going through some of these notes, I talked to James a little bit about what he and his family did as well. And so you'll see a few pictures in here that come from James in there. And I guess it's a theme. James is retiring here in about a month, and he's been spent a lot of years being dedicated to the university, and we appreciate what he's done, and we're going to miss him when he goes on. So with that, I'll get into a little bit of background on sorghum. Some of this is probably common knowledge to some of you on here, but I always, when I'm teaching students in class and such, I always like to talk about where a crop got started. And when it comes to sorghum, the most scientists agree that sorghum really got started somewhere in northeastern Africa. There's some archaeological finds near the modern Egypt-Sudan border of sorghum that go back to about 8,000 BC. If you're keeping track of that, that's about the dawn of agriculture from what most people understand. That's about the same time that they saw evidence of corn or maize here in the Americas. It's about the same time frame that they found evidence of wheat and barley and rye being domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, which we know today is Iraq, Iran, part of Syria, Jordan, Israel, and down into Egypt. And so you see all of these crops getting developed at about this same time frame, somewhere in there. We come into more recent history and look at sweet sorghum and where it is in terms of the U.S. In 1853, William Prince over in Flushing, New York, grew Chinese sorghum, which actually came from France. Now, I don't know the backstory on that. You've got a Chinese sorghum that came out of France, and so obviously there's another backstory there that we just don't know for the moment. But in 1855, there was a patent passed out for a small amount of sorghum seed, and in the Caribbean, sweet sorghum became an alternative to those growing cane sugar, which is really interesting because if you're familiar with history in that area, a lot of cane sugar was grown in the Caribbean. And there's still a fair bit that is today in parts of the Caribbean and certainly in southern Florida and also over into parts of Louisiana. Now, some of the early varieties of sweet sorghum included amber, early Minnesota amber, orange, Collier honey, and gooseneck. And at one point in time in that process, Dr. Bitzer grew all of these in his research trials. He had them in the plant breeding trials as well. Some of these in the plant breeding trials, he was looking at which sorts of genetics he would like to try to advance to make sweet sorghum a more profitable option, more productive option for a lot of you all in here. And so let's go through a little bit of the sweet sorghum, the plant itself. Again, some of this is some basic information, but the scientific name is sorghum bicolor, and it is the exact same species as Milo or grain sorghum, as the forage sorghums. Now, not the crosses, but the forage sorghum types, sweet sorghum, and then also the weed shatter cane. In fact, that weed shatter cane and regular grain sorghum only are different by about 3 traits in the process. And when I worked on my master's in Nebraska, I actually worked with shatter cane where we were trying to control it. And the primary source of the shatter cane was the Milo off types that had grown in some of those fields. And so that was part of our effort at the time working in that area. So I do have some background with sorghum bicolor, just a different member of the family. And we've all got cousins like that that we can relate to from time to time. So all of these are diploids. They all can cross pollinate. So the traits can move back and forth between these. And certainly in Kentucky, as you're already well aware, we grow a little bit of those 3: grain sorghum, forage sorghum, and sweet sorghum. We don't see a whole lot of shatter cane issues from time to time, but it is something that to keep an eye on. We used to see a fair bit of one of sorghum's maybe evil cousins, and that's Johnson grass, and that's Sorghum halepensi. It's a tetraploid. It's got the rhizome on it, and whenever the sorghum goes from a diploid into a tetraploid, we start to see rhizomes show up. So there's a couple different tetraploid species, but the Johnson grass one is by far the worst one that we deal with. And I say evil from the standpoint of typically when we're dealing with shatter or with Johnson grass, it's usually an unwanted plant that's interfering with what we're trying to grow. I know there was a year where I helped cut some sweet sorghum in a field to look at some productivity, and we had a pretty bad issue with some Johnson grass out there as well that we had to contend with. So I want to walk basically from that, go into some growth stages, and then we'll tie those growth stages into some management as we go through the rest of this. And so the growth stages for sorghum, there's 9 growth stages, 0 up to 9. And we'll walk through each of these kind of quickly. I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on any one of them, but 0 is emergence, and that's when the plant, the coleoptile, is pushing through the soil surface. You can see it. It has a little bit of a green color to it. That's the emergence. We've got a 3-leaf stage, which is just as just as clear as what it sounds like. You've got fully emerged leaves, 3 of them, with a visible collar, and the collar looks like what's going on my shirt. And so we have that we work with. Now there's also a 5-leaf stage, which is stage number 2, and it's the same thing. 5 leaves are visible on that scenario. So with all of that being considered, one thing I need to point out here is you'll see more than 5 leaves, but 5 of those leaves have the collar, the shirt collar, that's visible on them. There'll be probably as many as 3 additional leaves that'll be partially emerged and visible on the plant at those stages. And then growth stage 3, I wanted to focus in on this just for a moment because now we've got a differentiation taking place in our growing point. Up to this point, the plant was really focused on producing leaves, and now it switches over to producing the head and the seeds that go on that head. And so once you get to this growth stage 3, anything that you do management-wise could impact that reproductive development, the seed production of a sorghum plant. Now, by the time we get into 4, we're at the flag leaf stage, and that flag leaf is similar to what we have in our small grains, where that final leaf is visible in the whirl of the plant. The boot stage is when the head is nearly full size, but it's still enclosed in the sheath of the plant. And then we get to the half bloom stage. And half bloom, there's 2 different definitions for it. One's the field level, and the other one's the single plant. And so we'll expand on that. In the field level, you've got half the plants in the field, they're at some stage of bloom. And so that's one definition. When then, if you're looking at just a single plant, you've seen flowering that's progressed about halfway down the head. And so the flowering will start and move. Not all the flowers occur at the same time on a head. And so then we go from there. 7, 8, 9 all really deal with seed development at this point. So soft dough, hard dough, and then you get into physiological maturity, in which point the plant's done growing. It may still be green for a little while, but it's done adding any type of biomass at this point. The grain moisture is going to be somewhere around 35% on the high end, maybe about 25% in some at the start of this phase. And really after this, you're asking that grain just to dry down naturally in the field before it gets harvested if you're harvesting it as a grain. Most of you aren't going to go this far with your sweet sorghums unless you're trying to capture some seed for next year's crop. And most of the time we want to see the sweet sorghums go into some loams, maybe some sandy loams. They don't do as well in the clays. Some of the clay loams, it depends on the depth and it depends a little bit on drainage. If you've got decent drainage, but the clays tend to, as some of you may be aware, they tend to get too wet too quickly. Then they tend to also dry out very quickly. And that can lead to some challenging problems. And most of you that are attending tonight or maybe watching this later are living in some areas where you've got some very fertile bottoms. And so you're more into those loam type soils anyhow, which tend to be very productive soils, provided you don't have too much water and you have some other things that cooperate with you. Now, sweet sorghum is going to require less nitrogen than grain sorghum. But otherwise, other than that, you can pretty much follow AGR1, which is our lime and fertilizer guide for the other nutrients that we might, and amendments we might need to apply. And so pH, you're going to follow the lime recommendations and use agricultural lime. There's some temptation to use pelletized lime, but it's much more expensive. If you can get agricultural lime and apply it, it'll be much more cost effective. And usually those type of amendments to adjust your pH will last you for several years as well. So you may pay it 1 year, but it may last 2, 3, or 4 years before you have to do another adjustment. And that depends in part on your crop rotation and some things of that nature. When you're pulling the soil test, you can go to about a 4-inch depth. You can go up to 6 inches. If you go any deeper than 6 inches, it'll give us a bad reading. And so if I wanted to get a soil test value that came in lower than what it actually is, I'd pull a deeper soil core. And so you want to keep that soil core between 4 and 6 inches deep. Any deeper than that, and it's going to give you a bad reading on it. Pull about 15 samples on a 20-acre area. And really anything less than 20 acres, if you're in a small patch, you're still going to need about 15 samples to give you enough volume of soil to have it analyzed. You combine those soils together, send it off to one of our labs. In this case, they're coming up to Lexington to regulatory services there, and the county extension offices can help you with that. If you're over in Virginia, you'd send it over to one of the labs over there, and your agents over in that area can help you with that as well. Okay, some other things. So I mentioned lime earlier. You want to adjust your pH to be at least at 6.0. You'd like it to be somewhere between 6.0 and 6.8 in there. And what that pH does is it makes most of the nutrients available or more available to the crop. When you get into lower pH situations, the biggest issue with a low pH is that it starts to bind up some of these nutrients and make them less available to the crop. And so you're more likely to end up with other nutrient deficiencies if your pH isn't properly adjusted. Now, if you happen to have a summer and a spring where you got very timely rainfall and you got it every week when you needed it, not too much, not too little, then you probably wouldn't need to adjust your pH because most of these nutrients are taken up in the aqueous and the water solution through the root system. And if you had timely rainfall all the way through, then you probably wouldn't be as worried about pH. But most years, we don't get rainfall exactly when we need it every single time. And so because of that, by adjusting the pH, we make these nutrients more available. And so typically for most of our sweet sorghum crops, we need about 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's a very low rate compared to grain sorghum. We need maybe up to about 40 pounds of P2O5 of phosphorus and about 40 pounds of potassium per acre. So we don't need a tremendous amount of nutrients out there. And what does that look like if you're buying fertilizer? I know there's a lot of people that enjoy using triple 19. And if your soil test values are low for P and K, triple 19 is a good option. Okay, I'll say that one more time. If your soil test is low for P and K, then triple 19 is a good option. You put out 210 pounds of triple 19 and you end up with roughly 40 pounds of each of those three nutrients, N, P, and K. So that's good if you're low all the way around. But if you're not, so if you're high in P and K, and some of your fields are going to be, because you may have been using triple 19 for a lot of years, and so you might be higher in P and K than you realize. In that case, you could apply 100 pounds of urea, 4600, and that'll give you 46 pounds of N per acre, and apply 0 of the P or the K. And if you're wondering what urea is, if you've not used it before, urea is one of the ingredients in triple 19. When they make triple 19 fertilizer, urea is one of the ones they use to blend to make that fertilizer. Okay. So if you were high in P, but you're low in K in a field, well, now you could apply 100 pounds of urea, and you could go in and apply 80 pounds of muriate of potash, which is KCl or OO60. And in this case, you would get 46 pounds of N, and you get 48 pounds of potash from this system. This is a cheaper way to go than using triple 19 if you don't need the phosphorus in the field. And so these are just examples that I'm using. You pull your soil test, you take a look at AGR1, you might adjust your rates according to that. But one of the things in these management, if you're looking for ways to manage, it might be moving away from triple 19 if you don't need it into some of these specifics here. Now, where we're at, there are times when we want one of these specific ratios put together, and the dealerships up in this area will blend those for us. So we'll pay a small blending fee, get the two mixed together, then apply them that way because it's fitting for a research project that we're doing. You could do that as well in this situation. The potash also, the muriate of potash also is another ingredient in triple 19. And so the triple 19 is part urea, part potash, and then part phosphorus fertilizer as well. So they're blending those together. In this case, I'm just suggesting you take the raw components of that triple 19 and use those rather than spending the extra money on the triple 19. All right, I think I've sort of covered that enough at the moment. If you've got questions on that later, feel free to shoot me a question on that issue. Planting dates, most of you are probably aware of these as well. You're planting May 1 to May 20th for a full season variety. Those are later maturing. Your earlier maturings, you can go a little bit later in the season. And so we're all getting very close to these in terms of planting dates. They're not very far away. This is the 6th. So we're looking at roughly 20 days before we can start planting. You'd like to see your temperature somewhere around 65 degrees Fahrenheit or more when you're seeding sorghum, and at least 60 Fahrenheit or more for transplanted sorghum. And these temps are at a 2-inch depth in the soil, which is roughly where you're going to be placing that seed. So you'd like to have warm conditions. Ideally, you'd like to have a couple of days in the forecast that look favorable as well for growth. And I think this is an important thing here. Rather than getting hung up on planting absolutely on May 1 or trying to avoid May 20th, your weather, for the most part, is more important than the calendar, especially on these early plantings. Easy thing to say, it's a hard thing to implement because every year in the last few years, we've had high rainfall events in the spring, which have made planting more of a challenge. But last year in one of our studies where we were, in this case, we were studying corn, we'd had several rainfall events. We had tried to do an early corn planting. We couldn't get one to go in. We had the soil dry out just enough where we could plant, maybe, which by that I mean we could get across the field with a planter. That doesn't mean we should have planted. And they were calling for rain the next day. So we thought, well, maybe if we plant this, we'll avoid sidewall compaction. And so we chose to plant a couple passes just to see what would happen. And we decided not to plant anything else. And we ended up waiting about 10 days before we planted the rest of our studies. And sure enough, the stuff we planted early, we got some sidewall compaction, we had some stand reduction, and we lost on corn, we lost over 50 bushels to the acre on that by choosing to go into a field a little bit wet and causing some sidewall compaction. If you're planting and you cause sidewall compaction, it's really, really hard to overcome that. In fact, you typically you cannot. There's nothing you can put on top of that plant to fix that problem. And the same can be true if you're trying to transplant. You could actually make sidewall compaction all the way around that transplant. And what's happening is the roots come out, you've sealed off the furrow, or you've sealed off that the hole where you're putting in the transplants, and then those sides will harden up, and then the roots cannot get through. And if you have that scenario, you've lost any chance for decent yield in those fields. And at that point, it's not worth chasing more money after a bad situation. If you're direct seeding, you're typically in 36 or 40-inch rows. You're looking at 3 to 4 seeds per foot, hoping to get about 2 or 3 seeds per foot. I think most growers are in that 36-inch row range. We haven't seen a whole lot down in the 30-inch row setting. You certainly could do it. It gets a little bit harder to walk through when you start to go in and try to take the leaves off and such. But one thing you're wanting to try to avoid is this from happening. And so you want a tall, rangy plant, and I'll show you some data later on that backs that up, but you don't want them so spindly that they just fall over on you. And this is a storm that came through, knocked some of this down, and this becomes an absolute mess. And any of you that have grown sweet sorghum for more than a few years have had a spot or two do this on you, and you know how miserable this is to go through and try to pull those plants out. So with transplanting, some advantages for it is you can plant earlier. It's going to mature a little bit earlier. You got 4 to 5 seeds per cell. You're trying to get about 4 seeds total. Then you can space those plugs about 18 to 24 inches apart when you go into the field. And so that allows you to get an earlier start on your setup. If you're going to transplant, you'd use the same method that you do for tobacco float trays. You're looking at a little bit of fertilizer being applied into that system. And in about 2 to 3 weeks, the plants are going to get somewhere in about that 8 to 10 inches tall, and then you can transplant. One of the things that we're not mentioning in here that we should is that you can also try to select for some uniform plant sizes. So when you go put them in the field, you've got plants that are all about the same growth stage, and you can get a really nice stands from doing that method. A little more labor intensive, but it does provide some advantages if you're trying to grow a fair bit of sorghum out there. Now, as I mentioned before, Todd and Morris, both of them have done some plant breeding, and they've actually worked on some hybrids of grain sorghum and some lines of grain sorghum that potentially are certainly worth taking a look at. And so if we compare this Kentucky 1810 and then KN Morris, so KN Morris, the K stands for Kentucky, the N stands for Nebraska. Morris Bitzer had started looking at parents from Nebraska and crossing those with parents from Kentucky. And Todd finished out one of those crosses and decided to name it after Morris, which I thought was a really nice touch and befitting honor for Morris after his passing. So we've got Kentucky 1810 and KN Morris. Both of them are about 45 days after June in terms of maturity. They're roughly 8 days earlier than Dale. They get about the same height as Dale, but the overall stalk yield and sugar yield for these two are much greater than Dale. Now, later, I want to show you some data that says typically later maturing and typically taller plants get you into better yields. That's true on average, but in this scenario, you've got two different varieties developed here at Kentucky that are earlier than Dale, but higher yielding than Dale. And so there's another couple that are being looked at on the early side, this 08, 0238 and Simon. And that 08238 should get a different name if it gets released. I don't think it has yet, but I may be mistaken on that. If we go and look at, this is a lot of data here. And if you're looking at this on your computer screen, it's going to be hard to read this. And so I'll try to go through it somewhat quickly. And maybe one of the takeaways here before I get into it is that there were some variety tests going on to look at how these varieties compared to each other. And in this case, we've got these arranged from the earliest, which is Simon, to the latest, which is M81E. And so those are the days after June 30th that you see each of those in here. Now you go look at height. You can see our shortest ones tend to be the earlier maturing ones. Our taller ones tend to be the later maturing ones, with the exception of KN Morris and Della and Kentucky 1810, which are on the earlier side of maturity, but some of the taller varieties that are available. If we look at yields, well, Sugar Drip is about the lowest yielding and Bailey is about the highest yielding here in terms of stock yields. If we look at sugar content, it's a little more all over the place, not as clear as of a separation. But if you look at like sugar yield overall, Sugar Drip is among one of the lowest ones, if not the lowest, and top 76.6 was the highest in this case for this particular set of tests. And this is an average of 3 different tests over a 2-year period in there. If we look at the ones we talked about earlier, KN Morris and Kentucky 1810, and compare them to Dale, you can see that all of the KN Morris and the Kentucky 1810 are both doing better than Dale. And we're leaving Dale in here because we know that many people are using that as a standard. Both of those varieties are available. They're available through Foundation Seed, and you can access those if you wish. So some correlations from these variety tests. And now correlations, we need to be careful with these because what we're looking for is just a relationship. And so on a correlation, anything that's close to 1 means it's a 1-to-1 relationship. And so anything that's 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, 0.9, that's a pretty strong correlation between 2 things. Anything below 0.5, that's a pretty weak correlation. We may not be as interested in that overall. And so if you look at some correlations on those tests, stalk yield and sugar yield, 0.96, that's a really, really high correlation. And so what this tells us is if we're chasing stalk yield, that will help us with sugar yield on a per acre basis. This is a volume basis now. The bricks and sugar yield, interestingly enough, it's only about 0.57, so a much lower correlation there. And so even though some sorghums will produce more, have a higher bricks per pound of plant, they don't yield as well, and therefore they don't have as high of a sugar yield on a per acre basis. So now let's talk about height and stalk yield. A pretty good correlation between those two. Heading date and height, pretty strong correlation there. And then heading date and yield, a pretty decent correlation there as well. Again, the 2 exceptions are Kentucky 1810 and KN Morris that tend to be on the earlier side, but yield very well. But in general, across all of these different varieties that we're looking at, your taller plants, your later maturing plants tend to be the ones that will produce the most syrup per acre in your system. All right, weed control. So you'd like to do, you have the option to do some weed control up front, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But if you're going to cultivate, you want to start when the plants are about 4 to 5 inches tall. And you're trying to do cultivation on very small plants that have a very shallow root. And then that allows you to keep the cultivation itself quite shallow. And so you're just skimming the soil to cut out those roots. You're not going any deeper than you have to in that scenario. And so by doing that, you're disturbing as little soil as possible. It might mean a second or a third cultivation, but it's also the best way to keep track of those and control of those weeds. You do have the option to do dual up front. If you apply it pre-emergence, you need to have a safener on the seed, either concept or screen. If those safeners are not applied, you will get damage to the crop and the damage will not be acceptable. Now, there may be some years where there's an exception to that. And if you've in the past, if you've done that and you've gotten away with it, just consider yourself fortunate for that year. But go ahead and get the concept or the screen for this coming year if you can. Now, second thing here, dual is approved for post-emergence applications to sweet sorghum. If you're doing it post-emergence, you don't need the safener. Caveat here, the dual only controls weeds before they emerge. And so if your sorghum is up and there are no weeds that are up, applying dual is a really good option for you. If your sorghum is emerged, but you also have a lot of weeds that are emerged, then the dual is not going to help you very much in that scenario. You'd be better off to do a cultivation, then apply the dual and have it help you after that cultivation event. Another option is Callisto or mesotrione, which can also go over the top, and Callisto will help pick up a few weeds that the dual will not get. Probably if you're going to do anything over the top, you look at putting those two together. Dual can be very inexpensive to purchase overall, but dual you're using a pint per acre, where Callisto you're using, I think it's 3 ounces per acre, maybe as much as 6. But when you're buying a jug of Callisto, it's much more expensive per jug than what the dual is, because they've factored in how many acres they can cover with that jug. So if you've not bought Callisto before, there'll be sticker shock the first time you go to purchase it. You start to calculate out on a per acre basis, and it's actually not that expensive. Those are good options for you. Okay. Start talking about harvest timing. You're ideally trying to get the Brix level somewhere between 15.5 and 16.5. That's roughly between late milk and hard dough stage. And so we back on that seed development, somewhere between that late milk to hard dough stage, you're wanting to start the harvest timing in there. You would start typically at the milk stage, and you would dehead. You'd remove the heads from about 1 to 2 nodes from the top of the plant. And so that can be done while the plant's standing, or you could, and that's what a lot of people do. Some will actually wait and dehead after they've cut the plants up. And that's just an option you can do either way. In this case, these plants were stripped and then cut and stacked. And so the leaf removal can occur before cutting. You can take something like a fiberglass pole, or almost like those fence posts that you use to electric fence posts that you might use to move for rotational grazing. You take one of those out and help knock the leaves off that way if you want to, or you can let the stalks dry out some before you crush them and pull the leaves off at that point in time. You cut the stalks at the base, remove the heads down to the first node, and wait 3 to 5 days before you mill them, typically. This is looking at one of the presses. Again, this is with James's family, the press that they've got set up that they're working with. And then James decided that having people walk around and pushing that press by hand is not as much fun. So he rigged up took an old lawnmower and rigged up a gear system on it to where it would actually run and crank that press. And so he's cranking the press that way instead. And I think the family quickly jumped over to the lawnmower and decided they liked it when they're looking at it. And then so you start getting into the process of boiling it down and such. Now you're way out of my area. I'm an agronomist. I like to talk about how to grow a crop. This is some specialty in here, but ultimately that's what you're after, is looking at that component of it. So I think with that, I feel like I kind of rushed through the slides tonight, but hopefully there's a little bit of information in there that you can glean out of it and use in your sweet sorghum operations. And as I said before, if you've got questions, feel free to send them on over to Shad, or if you want to get a hold of us later on, we'll be happy to talk to you then about those as well.
Dr. Lee, one of the questions I had, this came up from a producer here in the county a couple of years ago, is if there were certain varieties that were better about resisting that lodging, because he had his sorghum blow down 2 or 3 years in a row. He's in a narrow river bottom, and I guess it funnels the wind through. And I just wanted to ask that question.
Well, the scenario you're given is a challenging scenario for almost any of these. There, a couple of things would be, I'm going to give you a couple assumptions up front on this, and then I'll answer this specific question. And so one of the assumptions would be that they're not putting out too high of a nitrogen rate to make the plants more susceptible to lodging, and they're not putting out too thick of a population. And so if we're assuming both of those are maintained and roughly in the guidelines that I mentioned tonight, then Morris and Kentucky 1810 have a little bit better lodging resistance than some of the others, but there are none of these that are lodging proof. if that makes sense. And so if you have those heavy winds coming through that area, that's going to be hard to overcome by genetics alone. It might be a scenario where they want to thin out the population a little bit, end up with a bigger stalk size, um, or simply go to one of the shorter sweet sorghums on here, just to try to avoid that issue as well. Neither one of those are great answers, and neither one of those are going to be foolproof in terms of trying to fight against that wind, but those might be options.
Does anybody ever attempt some sort of a post and wire system that would kind of prevent the lodging that way?
I don't know if anybody's done it. I'm sure there are some who've tried. I don't believe Morris or Todd did any of that in their systems. I think they were more looking at if it's very, very weak, we're just not going to worry about it. And we'll call that out of our plant breeding system. It certainly could be done. It would require some labor to make that work, but it could be done.
What about a wind break? Like if you knew where the prevailing winds came from?
That would be, of the things we're talking about, that would be the better option in here. And so, I mean, whether you decide to go ahead and plant some trees of some type that might block that ultimately might be the way you want to go. Or if you want to go and mimic what you see out in places like Wyoming and the far western Nebraska and some of those places, they've got some pretty massive wind breaks that they have built, as much to help a snowdrift as anything. You could build a structure like that. I'd probably lean toward trying to plant a few trees in that area first to try to block that wind.
Okay. Anyone else? Jeremy, Woody, Phil, Lona?
Yeah, I've got a question. I was running late, but the question would be, you may have addressed it already, Dr. Lee, but the difference between molasses and sorghum.
Well, now see, this is the question that Morris loved, right? Absolutely loved. And so molasses is the leftover, right, in a process where sorghum and sorghum syrup is the primary extract that you're looking at. So I know colloquially, we all call it, molasses. And I know that drove Morris crazy when we call it that. But molasses was a byproduct of the sugar making process. In this case, the syrup is the primary product.
I'll tell you a story of Morris. He did come down to Whitley County once when I was an agent there, and he did a program, and probably the most controversial program. He did a great job, loved it, but ruffled some feathers on 2 points. Number one was insisting that it wasn't molasses, and then number two, insisting that they didn't need to strip the leaves off. So people were a little bit hot. There was a little bit of quarreling at the end of that, but it was an excellent program.
Yeah. And his point there is if you let the leaves dry for a few days, then there'll be a non-issue. I know when we do biomass measurements, and particularly once the leaves have dried out, they're such a small component of the overall weight in sorghum and in corn that's his argument there, is you can get away with that. But as you know, the whole sorghum harvesting process is typically such a community event involved. I'm less likely to quarrel over something like that, because you probably got 2 or 3 people in the family that are designated as the leaf strippers in the process. And if you take that away, now what are they going to do?
Right.
So I, if you got the people and the manpower or the people power to get it done, go ahead and strip the leaves off of it.
We watched Hoosiers, and that's how they did it on the movie. So
yeah, right. But they did it like in February, which I never could figure out. How in the world they let that sorghum get into February?
Are there any companies? I know at least the last time I looked into it, there was nobody making new sorghum mills. Are there any companies specializing in that equipment now, or are you still just pretty much stuck with what's already been manufactured?
I think you're pretty much caught with what's been manufactured now. I've been asking James what he's going to do during retirement. James is a phenomenal machinist and mechanic. Likes to work on his own schedule, but you saw that little thing that he built, that press that he built out of that lawnmower. Somebody might want to get a hold of him and see if he can't tear one apart and rebuild it if they need that process done.
Matt Cottle, our local guy, he has old presses, but he was telling me that a lot of the new ones are coming out of China. So I don't know what the metal quality would be, but he said that they were producing new ones. They were just
okay.
Coming from overseas.
Okay.
I've seen a couple of new presses, and they just don't have the quality that the older presses do have.
Don't have the weight to them.
Don't have the weight, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can tell by looking at it. It's
yeah.
A little flimsier. They're nice. They're nice looking. They're painted nice. That sort of thing. They just don't seem to have the quality of the ones made in the 40s and 50s.
Back when you're dealing with cast iron, right? And yeah, back when a truck door weighed 100 pounds, at least it felt like it did.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So I think your better option is looking at people that can service some of the old ones and update them in that process. So,
about seed sources, I know Townsend's got flooded, or at least that was my understanding, that they got flooded, and I don't know if that cost them their supplies or not. But where do most folks around here acquire their seed and the specialty type stuff?
Yeah, he's been a primary one, and I didn't realize that he had gotten flooded in that event as well. At least I didn't realize his shop area had gotten flooded. So he's been the primary seed source that I've been aware of in this. And I mentioned our foundation seed, which usually folks are buying that and then growing it out and selling that as well. So my best answer would be to get on that Sweet Sorghum Grower site and see who else has got some seed available. They'd probably have some more recent information on that, Shad.
Okay.
What about crop rotation?
That's a great question. In almost every crop that we grow, annual crop, so whether it's corn, soybean, grain sorghum, sweet sorghum, any of these, if you grow them in the same field year after year, we take a yield hit when we do that. And so if you could put another species out there the next year and make money doing it, that's one thing that often doesn't get mentioned. So whatever that crop may be, that would benefit you from a yield per acre standpoint. Now, you probably don't want to go from grain sorghum into corn or from corn back into grain sorghum. So you'd be better off with something like soybean or vegetables or something like that in your rotation if you can do it.
How many years?
Just one.
Okay.
Just one. Once you do that single rotation, so there have been some studies done looking at those rotations versus doing a crop continuously over time, and we have some studies up at Lexington that have looked at some of that. And we say you need to figure about a 10 to 15% yield loss on average when you're in a continuous cropping system.
Yeah.
And so once you rotate out, now some years that yield penalty will be 0. Other years it'll be 25, but it averages out to about 10 to 15% over time. So,
And
but I also recognize
in the soil.
Well, go ahead.
Is that just pathogens in the soil that are affecting the plant, or?
I'll tell you, we call it rotation effect, and that means we don't fully know what it all might be. Pathogens are certainly part of it. There have been a lot of studies done on this in corn, because in the upper Midwest, so Illinois and Iowa and some places like that, you see a lot of farmers will do corn, and then soybean. And And you get out to Nebraska where I did my master's, the corn's under irrigation. There have been fields in corn for 30, 40 years when I was out there as a grad student. And in that scenario, they've got the water, they got the corn crop, they got a lot of cattle that they're feeding in state, and there's a market there for it, and that's why they're doing that. But in all of those scenarios, there have been these rotation studies done, and people have looked at different things, and pathogens are part of it, so they remove the pathogens out, or they do some studies where the pathogens are no longer an issue, and they still see the rotation effect. The only thing that sort of hints at what might be going on is there was a study done in northern Illinois on corn, so this isn't sorghum, where the researchers removed all of the above ground biomass off the field, took all of it away from the field, and then did management, and what they saw was a yield that got closer to what the rotation yield was. And so they thought there was maybe something to that effect, but they couldn't document. What's that?
Is that like a allelopathy or?
Well, they're not entirely sure because they couldn't document a specific disease that was an issue or an insect, and there's nothing like that. And so the answer is I don't know either, and we just call it a rotation effect. I don't fully know. You can't efficiently overcome that rotation effect. Now, having said all of that, there's a lot of fields up in that part of the world where they have corn after corn. They may do 2 years of it or 3 years of it, and the economics justify it. Even when they take the hit, the economics justify it. And most of those farmers will tell you, well, that doesn't happen on my farm. I know I got this, they all say, well, after 2-3 years, then I'm over it. And there's long-term studies up there that show, no, you're not. It's just over time, your yields are increasing because you're buying new genetics and updating your management and those sort of things. But if you still look at it versus the rotation, that rotation penalty is still in there. And so I'm saying all that to say there are going to be some fields from some people here tonight that are probably going to be in sorghum year after year because it fits with their logistics, it fits with their economics, it fits with what they're doing. And so that's okay. That's okay. You just recognize that there's a few challenges when you go into that system.
Dr. Lee, what are the trends in growing sorghum? Is the production going up? And are there future, are there niche markets or other things that might be a factor for producers to consider?
I'm probably not the right person to talk about the trends. That's probably more over in the ag econ side of things. But there is more interest in locally grown foods and local food products. And so I do think that there's some opportunities there. There's a lot of people that have an interest in trying to grow a few crops that have a more local flair to them. And so it's probably in some of those areas that you'll see some angles. And there'll be farmers trying to connect maybe with a restaurant or two in the area they're wanting to do local flavors, local food type things. And by the area, I mean, that area might actually be Lexington. So it might be that you're shipping some stuff up to Lexington or down to Knoxville, maybe over to Bristol, depending upon where you're at in that process. And so maybe to Pikeville. So I think those are some avenues that way. But I couldn't tell you if the total acreage is up or down or that.
Anyone else? We had some others on here that I didn't see below. The doc is on here, and Caitlin's phone. Phil, I think those are your folks. I don't know if any of them have questions or not. All right. Well, Dr. Lee, thank you very much for the presentation. It was excellent, and we appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Jeremy, what do we have coming up for the Thursday?
I'm gonna toss that to Phil. I think he's got lined out. So I'm gonna toss that over to Phil. Thank you much.
The one coming up Thursday night is on growing garden melons, watermelons, cantaloupes, honeydews, and that's going to be led by Dr. Natalie Bumgardner from the University of Tennessee. I know a lot of our growers in the 3 counties, including myself. I've grown some melons that look good and just had no flavor whatsoever. And a lot of people deal with different disease issues. So Natalie's going to kind of walk us through the process of growing good melons in the backyard.
Very good. Well,
Sounds good. Sounds good.
thanks to everyone for tuning in tonight, and we hope we'll see you on Thursday. And otherwise, we hope you have a good end to the rest of the day. See you Thursday.